To build on the foundation that Sam Harris laid in the moral landscape so that we can create an optimal human value system, let's start with a concrete example. Let's talk about an optimal food. Sam uses the example that morality is actually similar to the field of health. Just as we don't have an unambiguous definition of exactly what health is, that doesn't stop us from having a great amount of knowledge about what leads to health and what leads to disease. In the same way, just because we don't have an unambiguous definition of thriving and well-being doesn't mean that we can't use the basic scientific method to discover what actually leads to thriving and well-being and what leads to suffering and destruction. So I'll extend this analogy between morality and health by examining the question of what is an optimal food for human being. And to do this, we'll use the following question. What are the criteria we would use to judge a particular food as optimal or horrible for human beings? And as we ask and answer this question, I'm going to lay out the methodology with which we'll create an optimal human value system. I'll take a little time with this part because once you understand this methodology, then pretty much everything else I say will be obvious. It'll just be an extension of common sense, which is one of the criteria we want to fit for an optimal human value system. So, again, the question is, what are the criteria by which we would judge a food to be optimal or horrible for human beings? And as you hear the question, you'll probably recognize, well, there's a number of dimensions on which we judge a food to be optimal or horrible. Well, let's take a couple of those core dimensions one at a time. And we can start with the first one of flavor, or how does the food actually taste? So if we were to draw a spectrum or a dimension of flavor, we might say that on one end of the spectrum we have food that tastes delicious, and on the other end of the spectrum we have food that tastes disgusting. And in the exact middle we have food that tastes neither delicious nor disgusting, has a neutral taste, sort of like most English cuisine. So the farther you move towards this end of the spectrum, the more delicious the food becomes. And the farther you move towards this end of the spectrum, the more disgusting the food becomes. Now, are you ready for the big revelation? In order for a food to be optimal, it would be on the delicious side of the spectrum, not the disgusting side of the spectrum. All right? Once I've defined my terms, the answer is obvious. In fact, it's so obvious it has what I like to call the no-duh factor. So that when you hear the explanation, your response is, well, no duh, David, or no something, Sherlock, or something like that. Right? It's obvious, which is exactly what we want. We want all of the distinctions that we use in the process of creating an optimal human value system to be obvious, that as soon as you understand the terms, you go, oh, of course, that. Because it's on top of that that we can build a shared reality, a shared value system that anyone with common sense and a desire to understand can agree to. So that the clearer you are about this distinction we're suggesting, the more obvious the optimal choice becomes, the more obvious the optimal values become. So the first dimension that we distinguished around optimal food is flavor or taste. And the first distinction is between delicious and disgusting, with delicious being on the optimal end of the spectrum and disgusting being on the horrible end of the spectrum. Now, a second core dimension we might examine around optimal food is its nutrition, or how eating it affects our health. And on this dimension, on the optimal end of the spectrum, we have food which is nutritious, it's high nutrition, it's good for us. And on the horrible end of the spectrum, we have food which is actually poisonous to us. And then in the middle, in the neutral zone, it's neither nutritious nor poisonous. And again, the more we move towards the optimal side of the spectrum, the more nutritious the food is. Or the more nutritious the food is, the more we move it towards the optimal side of the spectrum, because we're creating the spectrum. And the more poisonous it is, the more towards the horrible end of the spectrum it becomes. And again, obviously, an optimal food is going to be on the nutritious side of the spectrum, not the poisonous side of the spectrum. No! Duh, David. Exactly. Now, here's where it starts to get interesting. We've got two dimensions, each of which is obvious. Let's see what happens when we put them together. In its simplest form, this provides us with 4 possible choices. And to see this, let's take the dimension of nutrition and move it from horizontal to vertical like this. And once we do this, it makes sense to draw a 2x2 matrix with 4 different quadrants numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. In quadrant number 1, the food tastes disgusting, but it's nutritious. In quadrant number 2, the food tastes delicious and it's nutritious. In quadrant number 3, the food tastes disgusting and it's poisonous. And in quadrant number 4, the food tastes delicious, but it's poisonous. Now, here's the test question. Of these 4 quadrants, when we're looking at an optimal food, which quadrant do we want for the optimal food? Ta-da! Or no-da, Sherlock? Right? We want both nutritious and delicious. We want the best of both worlds, or what I call integrating the optimal. When we take the optimal choice on multiple dimensions and integrate it together so that it's both and the best of both worlds, that's what we call integrating the optimal. So, now that you, my brilliant audience, know that an optimal food would have to be both delicious and nutritious, right? If someone were to suggest that an optimal food was disgusting and poisonous, you just kind of edge your way away from them, right? And go, oh, you're missing the point. But notice, even if they said that the optimal food would be delicious but poisonous, you have to say, whoa, I'm not sure that you thought this through. Or even if they just said that it was delicious, but we don't need to even examine it to see if it's poisonous or not. You'd say, you know, I'm not sure that you're really thinking this all the way through. Oh, or you haven't examined the core dimensions and integrated the optimal on it. Right? Similarly, if someone were to say, well, I've got this food and it's really nutritious, but it tastes like somebody already ate it once and left the remains out in the sun for a couple days, or even if they just said, it's really nutritious, but it tastes like cardboard, you'd have to say, you know, really, that might be okay, but it's not optimal. An optimal value would be both delicious and nutritious. And this is the power of starting to distinguish dimensions and define distinctions on those dimensions. Notice that even with just 2 dimensions, we end up with a 1 in 4 choice, or we've eliminated 75% of the options and we're now down to 25%. So with just 2 dimensions, we've increased our opportunity to make optimal choices by a significant amount. So let's take this another step and add a 3rd dimension on which to judge whether or not a food is optimal or horrible. And this dimension, let's have it be the dimension of cost or price, with inexpensive being on the optimal side of the dimension where it only costs pennies per meal, and exorbitant being on the horrible side of the spectrum where it costs millions of dollars for every meal. And again, obviously, the optimal food is going to be on the inexpensive side where everyone can afford it, and the horrible food is going to be on the exorbitant side where only a handful of people can afford it. So again, once we clarify the terms, the choice becomes obvious. Now, let's integrate all 3 dimensions. And the easiest way to visualize this is to take our 2x2 matrix with 4 quadrants that's in 2 dimensions and then add the 3rd dimension to it, similar to adding depth. And again, when we integrate the optimal of all 3 dimensions, we end up with the top right forward cube, which is delicious and nutritious and inexpensive. The 1 in 8 choice, or 12.5%. We've essentially taken 87.5% of the choices available and taken them off the table so that we don't need to really consider them, because we want the best of both worlds. We want delicious and nutritious and inexpensive. And in so doing, we've essentially increased our capacity to make an optimal choice by an order of magnitude with just 3 simple distinctions, because each of these distinctions are core properties of what would make a food optimal. Now, are these the only dimensions on which we would measure whether or not a food is optimal or not. Of course not. However, they are a core set of dimensions that give us real insight into the question, and we could say that any analysis of what would make a food optimal that doesn't include whether or not it's how it tastes, whether or not it's delicious, whether or not it's nutritious, whether or not it's inexpensive enough that people can afford it, any analysis that didn't take those dimensions into account, we would say is incomplete and misses important information that will predictably lead to bad choices and a suboptimal value. But let's add a couple more dimensions to optimal food so we can really get this methodology down pat and see how it works. So, as a next dimension, we might consider how convenient the food is. With on the one hand it being incredibly convenient, on the other hand it being completely inconvenient. For example, the optimal food would be pretty easy to make, and it would be portable. It would last for a period of time, and it would be something that's small enough that we could carry with us, right? Whereas the suboptimal food, the horrible food, would be something that's incredibly perishable, very difficult to make, and virtually impossible to transport, right? And again, the optimal food would be convenient rather than inconvenient. And so we add convenient to the mix, and now we've got 4 dimensions, which gives us a total of 16 choices, of which we want the one choice, which is delicious and nutritious and inexpensive and convenient, right? So we've got the one choice out of 16. That puts us at 6.75%. And as a 5th dimension, we might look at how creating the food impacts the culture and the environment, with something being sustainable on the optimal side and something being incredibly destructive on the horrible side. So that if when you make the food, it actually makes the soil richer and the people who interact with it have pleasant smells and enjoy their experience, that would be optimal. Whereas if when you harvest the food, it makes the soil toxic for 100 years and the people who interact with the food get sick and get depressed because it's so ugly and disgusting, that would be horrible. Right? And again, so now we've got a 5th dimension, so it'd be delicious and nutritious and inexpensive and convenient and sustainable, so it enriches our environment rather than depleting it. And again, so now we've got 5 dimensions, each of which has 2 poles, and that gives us the 1 in 32 choices, which puts us down under 4%. Now, we might be able to add more dimensions to this process of optimal food, but they're becoming less and less obvious, and hence we're getting less and less bang for our buck in terms of getting agreement about this is what makes a food optimal versus suboptimal. So, but notice with just these 5 dimensions, when we integrate the optimal and get the 1 in 32 choice, again, we're down to under 4%. This is a significant advantage to be able to take 95% of the options, take them off the table, and focus on that small range of how we can get more and more bang for our buck, more thriving and less suffering from our choice of foods. And with that example of optimal food, we've got a pretty good understanding of the basic methodology for optimal human values, which is distinguish a dimension, define the distinction of optimal versus horrible, and then integrate the optimal. Now, let's move from the specific realm of optimal food back into the larger context of optimal human values as a whole. In the process, we will revisit Sam Harris's work in the moral landscape and begin to delineate out what the core dimensions of optimal human values would be, and what are the key distinctions that allow us to distinguish between optimal and horrible, so that when we integrate the optimal, we can use science to determine human values. Again, I'm Mark Michael Lewis, head coach of the game of thriving, where the more you play, the better your life gets. And I'll see you in the next video.